The biting cold of December 1878 seared through Nora Patterson's lungs as her wagon lurched violently, the wooden wheels catching on a hidden patch of ice beneath the snow-laden trail to White River, South Dakota. Nora clutched desperately at the reins, her knuckles white against the leather straps as the terrified horses reared and neighed. The crack of splintering wood pierced the howling wind as the wagon tilted precariously on the narrow mountain pass. "Steady!" She called to her horses, but her voice was lost in the merciless blizzard that had descended without warning upon the Dakota territory. What had begun as a light snowfall during her journey from Missouri had transformed into a raging storm, obscuring the trail that would lead her to her new life. At 22, Nora had left behind everything familiar: her parents' modest farm, the comfort of predictability, and the pressure to marry a man she did not love. The teaching position in White River had promised independence, purpose, and escape from the suffocating expectations of rural Missouri society. Her vision blurred with tears of frustration and fear as the wagon lurched again. The right wheel had slipped over the edge of the path. In a desperate bid to prevent disaster, Nora threw her weight to the left, but physics and nature conspired against her. The wagon tipped, sending her tumbling into the snow as the vehicle rolled onto its side. Pain shot through her leg, sharp and immediate. The world spun, white and gray blurring together as she found herself pinned beneath the overturned wagon, the weight crushing against her lower body. "Help!" The word tore from her throat, lost in the endless white. "Someone, please!" The cold began to seep into her bones, a dangerous lethargy threatening to overwhelm her. Nora fought against the drowsiness, knowing it meant death in these temperatures. She pushed against the wagon with all her strength, but it refused to budge. Her horses had broken free, disappearing into the swirling snow. She was alone on the mountain pass, trapped beneath hundreds of pounds of oak and supplies, with night approaching and the temperature plummeting. Time passed in a haze of pain and cold. Nora's thoughts drifted to her family, to the letters she had sent announcing her safe arrival, letters that would now never be sent. She thought of the children she would never teach, the life she would never live. Through the howling wind, she barely registered the sound of hoofbeats. A hallucination, surely a cruel trick of her fading mind. "Hello," a deep voice cut through the storm. "Is someone there?" Hope surged through Nora's veins, giving her a final burst of strength. "Here, I'm trapped under the wagon." A shadow materialized through the blinding white, a tall figure on horseback. The rider dismounted swiftly, approaching the overturned wagon with purposeful strides. "Don't move, madam," the man instructed, his voice calm and steady as he assessed the situation. He was bundled against the cold, his face partially obscured by a scarf, but Nora could see piercing blue eyes evaluating the wagon's position. "My leg," she managed through chattering teeth. "I think it's broken." The stranger nodded, positioning himself at the edge of the wagon. "I'm going to lift this. When I do, I need you to pull yourself free if you can." "Ready?" Nora nodded, gathering what little strength remained. With a grunt, the man braced his shoulders against the wagon's side and lifted. Muscles strained visibly through his heavy coat, as he raised the vehicle just enough for Nora to drag herself from beneath it, crying out in pain as her injured leg scraped across the snow. The man carefully lowered the wagon and was at her side in an instant, strong arms gathering her close. "I've got you safe now," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air as he cradled her against his chest. "Name's Bryce Buchanan. I'm going to get you out of this storm." Bryce carried her to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that stood patiently in the blizzard. With gentle but efficient movements, he settled Nora in the saddle before mounting behind her, one arm securing her against him while the other held the reins. "My things," Nora protested weakly, looking back at the overturned wagon. "They'll have to wait," Bryce replied, his voice firm but kind. "Nothing in there is worth your life. We need to get you warm." He guided the horse carefully down the treacherous path, navigating by some internal compass that Nora couldn't fathom. The storm raged around them, but Bryce moved with the confidence of a man who knew these mountains intimately. "How far?" Nora asked, her words slurring slightly as the cold continued its assault on her consciousness. "My cabin's about a mile from here," he answered, tightening his hold on her as she swayed. "Stay with me, Miss Patterson," she supplied. "Nora Patterson, Miss Patterson." "Keep talking. Tell me what brings a young woman out alone in this weather." Nora tried to focus, using his deep voice as an anchor. "Teaching position. In White River. I'm supposed to start after New Year's." "White River? That's still 15 miles east," Bryce said, concern evident in his tone. "You're lucky I was checking my trap lines. No one else comes up this way in winter." Nora wanted to thank him, to express her gratitude, but darkness was crowding the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the solid warmth of his chest against her back and his voice, urgent now, telling her to stay awake. When consciousness returned, Nora found herself wrapped in thick blankets before a roaring fire. The pain in her leg had dulled to a persistent throb, and her wet clothes had been replaced with a man's flannel shirt that hung past her knees and thick woolen socks. Panic fluttered briefly in her chest before she noticed her own clothing drying on a rack near the fire. A flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks at the realization that someone had undressed her, but practicality quickly overrode modesty. In these temperatures, wet clothing meant death. The cabin was small but well constructed, with a single main room containing a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cooking area, and a bed, the very bed she now occupied. A curtained-off section likely contained storage or perhaps a washing area. "You're awake." Bryce emerged from behind the curtain, carrying a steaming mug. He had removed his heavy outer clothing, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered frame dressed in simple but clean attire, a flannel shirt similar to the one she wore and well-worn trousers. His face, now fully visible, surprised her. She had expected someone weathered and aged by the harsh frontier, but Bryce appeared to be in his late 20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble, those startling blue eyes and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "How long was I unconscious?" Nora asked, her voice raspy. "A few hours," he replied, approaching the bed and offering the mug. "It's willow bark tea, will help with the pain." Nora accepted the drink gratefully, wincing as she shifted to a more upright position. "My leg." "Not broken, fortunately," Bryce said, pulling one of the chairs closer to the bed and sitting. "Badly bruised and possibly sprained. You're lucky. That wagon could have crushed you." "Thank you," Nora said, meeting his gaze directly. "You saved my life." A hint of color appeared on Bryce's cheeks. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Nora insisted. "Most people wouldn't have been out in that storm to begin with, and many would have passed by, assuming no one could be foolish enough to be on that trail today." Bryce's lips quirked in a small smile. "Well, when you put it that way, it does seem you were rather fortunate in your rescuer." Nora sipped the bitter tea, grimacing at the taste but appreciating the warmth that spread through her. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "No repayment necessary," Bryce replied, standing to tend the fire. "Though I am curious what possessed you to travel alone to White River in December." Nora watched as he added another log to the flames, noting the efficiency of his movements. This was a man accustomed to self-sufficiency. "The teaching position was offered unexpectedly," she explained. The previous teacher eloped with a cattle baron, leaving the town without an educator mid-term. They were desperate enough to hire me sight unseen based on my references, but requested I arrive before the new term begins in January. Bryce nodded thoughtfully. Still, traveling alone is risky, especially for a woman. A familiar defensiveness rose in Nora. I'm quite capable, Mr. Buchanan. This isn't my first journey, though admittedly I underestimated the Dakota weather. Bryce, he corrected, and I meant no offense. The most experienced frontiersmen respect these winters. They're unforgiving to everyone, regardless of gender. Nora relaxed slightly. I apologize. I'm accustomed to having my independence questioned. Independence is admirable, Bryce said, returning to his seat. Foolhardiness is not. There's a difference between the two. I suppose today I strayed into the latter category, Nora admitted with a rueful smile. We all make mistakes, Bryce replied. The trick is surviving them long enough to learn from them. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. The storm had intensified, rattling the cabin's sturdy walls. You won't be going anywhere for a while, Bryce observed. This blizzard settling in could last days. Nora's eyes widened in alarm. Days, but I'm expected in White River by the end of the week. Unless you've mastered walking on snow and commanding the weather, you're staying put until it's safe, Bryce stated firmly. I didn't rescue you just to watch you freeze to death trying to reach town. The practical truth of his words was undeniable. Nora sank back against the pillows, frustration and resignation warring within her. What about my wagon, my belongings? Once the storm breaks, I'll retrieve what I can, Bryce promised, but much of it may be buried in snow or damaged. Nora nodded, trying to accept this new reality. Everything she owned was in that wagon: clothing, books, teaching materials, the small keepsakes that connected her to home. The thought of losing it all threatened to overwhelm her. Bryce seemed to sense her distress. Your things are just things, Miss Patterson. They can be replaced. You cannot. Nora, she corrected softly. If I'm to impose upon your hospitality for days, we should at least use our given names. Bryce's smile transformed his face, softening the stern lines and revealing a warmth that stirred something unexpected within Nora. Nora it is, he agreed. Are you hungry? I've got venison stew that's been simmering while you slept. At the mention of food, Nora's stomach rumbled audibly, prompting a chuckle from Bryce. I'll take that as a yes. He moved to the cooking area, ladling stew into 2 wooden bowls. The rich aroma filled the cabin, reminding Nora just how long it had been since she'd eaten. Can you manage to sit at the table? Bryce asked. Or would you prefer to eat in bed? Pride warred with practicality in Nora's mind. I should like to try the table if you'll help me. Bryce nodded, setting the bowls down before returning to her side. With gentle strength, he helped Nora stand, supporting her weight as she tested her injured leg. Pain shot through her calf, but it was bearable. Leaning heavily on Bryce, she hobbled the short distance to the table, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her, of the clean, woodsy scent that clung to him beneath the smoke from the fire. Once seated, Nora adjusted the oversized shirt to ensure her modesty was preserved. Bryce seemed studiously unaware of her state of undress, keeping his eyes politely averted except when directly addressing her. The stew was delicious, rich with meat and root vegetables, perfectly seasoned. Nora hadn't realized how ravenous she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. This is wonderful, she complimented between bites. You're quite the cook. Necessity, Bryce replied with a shrug. A man living alone either learns to cook or lives on jerky and hardtack. How long have you been here? Nora asked, genuinely curious about this solitary man who had appeared like a guardian angel in her hour of need. Bryce considered the question. Built this cabin 3 years ago. Before that, I drifted around the territory, worked as a ranch hand, did some scouting for the army. And now, I trap in winter, hunt, do some prospecting in the warmer months, trade with the Sioux when our paths cross. It's a quiet life, but it suits me. No family, Nora ventured, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. Forgive me, that's none of my business. No need for forgiveness, Bryce assured her. No family, not anymore. My parents died in a cholera outbreak when I was 16. Had a brother, but he was killed at Gettysburg. I'm sorry, Nora said softly, recognizing the understated grief in his words. Bryce acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. And you? Family waiting for news of your safe arrival, my parents and 2 younger sisters in Missouri, Nora confirmed. They'll be worried when they don't receive my letter, though they won't expect one until I've had time to settle in White River. When the storm breaks, I can ride to town with a message, Bryce offered. Let them know you're safe, just delayed. The kindness of this near stranger continued to surprise Nora. You've already done so much. It's nothing, Bryce said dismissively. Being alone doesn't mean being unkind. They finished their meal in companionable silence, and Nora found herself studying Bryce when he wasn't looking. There was a quiet strength to him, a self-contained quality that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin, untroubled by the solitude that would drive many to madness. May I ask you something? Nora ventured as Bryce collected their empty bowls. You may ask, he replied with the hint of a smile. I may not answer. What brings a man like you to live alone in the wilderness? You're educated, I can tell by your speech. You're clearly capable of thriving in civilization, yet you choose isolation. Bryce placed the bowls in a basin of water before answering. What makes you think I'm choosing isolation rather than escaping something else? The question hung between them, unexpectedly revealing. Nora considered her response carefully. Perhaps because I recognize a kindred spirit, she admitted. I came west not just for opportunity, but to escape expectations I couldn't fulfill. Bryce studied her with newfound interest. What expectations were those? To marry a suitable man, bear children, and tend a home while gradually surrendering my own dreams and ambitions, Nora replied honestly. I wanted more. I wanted to teach, to make a difference, to live by my own choices, even if those choices lead you into blizzards and overturned wagons. Bryce asked, his tone gently teasing. Nora laughed despite herself. Even then, at least they're my mistakes to make. Bryce returned to the table, his expression thoughtful. After the war, after losing everyone, towns felt too crowded, too noisy. People asked too many questions, wanted too many answers I didn't have. He gestured around the cabin. Here the silence makes sense. The solitude has purpose. I understand, Nora said, and she truly did. Though their circumstances differed greatly, they shared a fundamental desire for self-determination that the structured society of the East often denied. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin, the blizzard showing no signs of abating. You should rest, Bryce said, noting how Nora's eyelids had begun to droop despite her interest in their conversation. The body heals faster in sleep. Nora nodded, suddenly aware of the exhaustion seeping through her. The day's trauma, the relief of rescue, and the warm food had conspired to drain what energy remained. With Bryce's assistance, she returned to the bed, settling beneath the blankets with a sigh of gratitude. Where will you sleep? She asked, realizing belatedly that she had commandeered his only bed. I've got bedrolls and the fire, Bryce assured her. "I've slept in far worse conditions." Nora wanted to protest, to insist she take the floor instead, but her body betrayed her as another wave of exhaustion washed over her. "Thank you, Bryce," she murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "For everything." The last thing she heard was his soft reply. "Sleep well, Nora." Morning arrived with muted light filtering through frost-covered windows. The storm had diminished overnight, though snow still fell steadily outside. Nora woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the previous day's events came rushing back. Testing her leg, she found the pain had subsided to a dull ache. The cabin was quiet, and a quick glance revealed Bryce was gone. His bedroll lay neatly folded near the fire, which had been recently tended. Nora pushed herself up, wrapping one of the blankets around her shoulders over the borrowed shirt. Her own clothing still hung by the fire, now dry. With cautious movements, she stood, finding she could put weight on her injured leg as long as she did so gingerly. The door opened just as Nora reached for her dress, admitting Bryce and a blast of cold air. He carried an armload of firewood and stamped his boots to clear them of snow. "You're up," he observed, kicking the door closed behind him. "How's the leg?" "Much improved," Nora replied, clutching the blanket tighter around herself. "Though I won't be running any races soon." Bryce deposited the wood beside the fireplace. "Good. I was worried it might be worse than I thought." "Have you checked the weather?" Nora asked, nodding toward the door. "Storm's easing, but we've got at least 2 feet of fresh snow," Bryce reported. "Trail to White River won't be passable for days, maybe a week." Nora's heart sank. A week delayed meant arriving after the new term had begun if the town would even still want her after such tardiness. "I need to get word to them," she said, distress evident in her voice. "They'll think I've abandoned the position." "As soon as it's safe to travel, I'll go," Bryce promised. "But that won't be today. Weather's too unpredictable." Nora nodded, accepting the reality of her situation. "May I have some privacy to dress?" "Of course," Bryce said, moving toward the door. "I'll check on the horses. Take your time." Once alone, Nora quickly donned her own clothing, relishing the feeling of normalcy it provided. Her dress was simple but well-made dark blue wool suitable for the journey and her future profession. She had just finished buttoning it when Bryce returned. "I have a proposition," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "If you're feeling up to it, I could teach you a few survival skills while we wait for the weather to clear. Might come in handy for a woman determined to make her own way in the Dakota territory." Nora brightened at the suggestion. "I'd like that very much. What did you have in mind?" "Basic tracking, fire starting, identifying safe shelter in a storm," Bryce listed. "And how to tell when a blizzard's coming before you're caught in one." "That last one would have been particularly useful yesterday," Nora admitted ruefully. Bryce's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Hindsight has perfect vision. Now, how about breakfast?" "I shot a rabbit this morning." Over the next 3 days, as the storm gradually subsided and the sun emerged to create a blindingly white landscape, Bryce proved to be an excellent teacher. Patient but exacting, he showed Nora how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to build a fire using minimal kindling, and how to construct an emergency shelter if caught in the open. For her part, Nora was an eager student. The pain in her leg faded to occasional twinges, allowing her to move more freely. She insisted on contributing to their daily routine, taking over cooking duties and helping to maintain the cabin. Their evenings were spent in conversation that grew increasingly comfortable and wide-ranging. Nora shared stories of her childhood in Missouri, her passion for education, and her determination to prove that women could be independent without sacrificing femininity. Bryce, initially reticent about his past, gradually revealed more about his experiences during and after the war, his travels across the Western territories, and his decision to settle in the remote hills above White River. "It wasn't entirely isolation I sought," he admitted on the fourth night as they sat before the fire, cups of coffee warming their hands. "It was peace. After years of chaos and violence, I needed to remember what quietude felt like. Have you found it?" Nora asked, studying his profile in the firelight. Bryce considered the question seriously. "Most days. There are still nights when the war follows me into sleep, but they're fewer now." He turned to her, his expression open in a way it hadn't been before. "What about you? Will teaching in White River bring you the independence you're seeking?" "I believe it will," Nora replied, though something in her voice lacked conviction. "It's a beginning, at least, but not an end in itself." Nora smiled at his perception. "No. Eventually, I hope to start my own school, somewhere it's truly needed. Perhaps on an Indian reservation or in one of the settlements where children currently have no access to education." "An admirable goal," Bryce said with genuine approval. "The world needs more teachers willing to go where others won't." His words warmed Nora in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Throughout her life, her ambitions had been met with skepticism at best, outright discouragement at worst. To hear Bryce speak of her dreams with respect rather than condescension was unexpectedly affecting. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something shifted in the atmosphere, a recognition of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. For a moment, Nora thought Bryce might reach for her hand, might acknowledge the growing attraction that she was increasingly certain they both felt. Instead, he stood abruptly, moving to the window to check the weather. "Skies clear tonight. If it holds, I can try to reach your wagon tomorrow, salvage what's left." The moment passed, leaving Nora with a curious mixture of disappointment and anticipation. There was time yet, she realized. Days more before the trail to White River would be navigable. Days to explore whatever was developing between them. "I'd like to come with you," she said, joining him at the window. The night sky was breathtaking, stars diamond bright against the blackness, the snow-covered landscape reflecting their light. Bryce looked down at her, concern evident in his expression. "It's a hard trek, even for someone uninjured. Your leg is much improved," Nora interrupted. "And I've been cooped up in this cabin for days. Besides, they're my belongings. I should help recover them." Bryce studied her determined expression and finally nodded. "We'll see how the morning looks. If conditions are good and your leg is truly better, we'll go together." Morning dawned clear and cold, the temperature well below freezing but the sky a perfect blue. After a hearty breakfast, Bryce and Nora prepared for their expedition to the overturned wagon. Bryce provided Nora with extra layers thick woolen socks to wear beneath her boots, a fur-lined coat that engulfed her smaller frame, and sturdy leather gloves. He packed supplies in case they were caught in another weather change: food, matches, a small pot for melting snow, and blankets. The journey that had seemed so treacherous during the blizzard was transformed in the crisp winter sunlight. Bryce led the way, breaking a path through the deep snow, frequently checking on Nora's progress and adjusting their pace to accommodate her still tender leg. "How did you find me that day?" Nora asked as they rested briefly on a fallen log. "I was so disoriented in the storm, I'm not even sure where we are now." "I know these hills better than most know their own homes," Bryce replied. "I check my trap lines daily, and I have specific routes I follow. You were fortunate to overturn your wagon near one of them." "Providence," Nora murmured. Bryce smiled slightly. "Call it what you will. I'm glad I was there." They continued on, the sun rising higher as they climbed the gentle slope toward the pass where Nora's wagon had overturned. The snow squeaked beneath their boots, the air so cold that their breath froze in their scarves. "There," Bryce said eventually, pointing ahead. "I can see the edge of your wagon." Nora followed his gesture, spotting the dark shape partially buried in a snowdrift. As they approached, she could see that the vehicle lay exactly as they had left it, tipped onto its side, one wheel still extending into the air like a supplicant's hand. "It seems intact," she observed with relief. "I was afraid it might have been further damaged in the storm." "The storm probably protected it," Bryce said. "All that snow packed around it kept it stable." They reached the wagon, and Bryce immediately began assessing how best to access the contents. "We can't ride it not without horses and more hands. But we can retrieve what we can through the exposed side." For the next hour, they worked steadily, digging through snow to reach the wagon's interior. Many of Nora's possessions remained in their original positions, secured by the ropes she had used to tie down her cargo. Some items had shifted, and a few containers had broken open, spilling their contents. "My books," Nora exclaimed with joy, discovering her collection of educational texts and literature still packed in their wooden crate. "And my teaching supplies." Bryce helped her extract the heavy crate, setting it on solid ground. They continued salvaging what they could: clothing, household items, personal keepsakes. Some items were water-damaged from snow that had blown in through gaps in the wagon's canvas cover, but most were salvageable. "What about this?" Bryce asked, carefully lifting a small wooden case inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Nora's face lit up. "My mother's music box. I was certain it would be destroyed." She took the delicate object from him, her gloved fingers tracing the intricate pattern on its lid. "It was a wedding gift from my father, the only luxury they ever allowed themselves." "May I?" Bryce asked, gesturing to the box. Nora handed it back, watching as he examined it with surprising gentleness. "The mechanism might be damaged by the cold," he warned, "but we can try it." He opened the lid carefully. For a moment, nothing happened, and disappointment flashed across Nora's face. Then, as if gathering courage, the music box began to play a sweet, tinkling melody that seemed impossibly delicate in the vast silence of the snow-covered landscape. "Mozart," Bryce identified, surprising Nora. "You know classical music," he smiled, a hint of self-deprecation in the expression. "I wasn't born in these hills, Nora. I had a life before this one." The melody continued, the notes crystalline in the cold air, creating an unexpected moment of grace amidst the practical task of salvage. "It's beautiful," Bryce said softly, his eyes on Nora rather than the music box. Nora felt warmth rise to her cheeks despite the frigid temperature. The way Bryce looked at her, as if truly seeing her awakened feelings she had deliberately set aside in her pursuit of independence. The music stopped, the final notes hanging in the air between them. Bryce closed the lid gently and returned the box to Nora, their fingers brushing despite their gloves. "We should keep going," he said, his voice rougher than before. "We've got daylight yet, but I don't want to risk being out after dark." They resumed their work with renewed focus, though something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of attraction that neither seemed ready to address directly. By early afternoon, they had recovered most of Nora's essential belongings. What remained was either too damaged to salvage or too firmly wedged in the collapsed sections of the wagon. "The wagon itself is beyond repair," Bryce concluded, surveying the splintered wood and bent axle. "But we've saved what matters." They packed the salvaged items onto a small sledge Bryce had constructed and brought for this purpose. The load was substantial but manageable, and they began the return journey to the cabin with Bryce pulling the sledge and Nora carrying the lighter items. The trip back was slower, hampered by their burden and the declining daylight. Nora's leg began to ache more insistently, though she said nothing, determined not to slow their progress. Bryce, however, noticed her increasing limp. Without comment, he called for a rest near a stand of pines that offered some shelter from the wind that had begun to rise. "We're making good time," he assured her, helping her settle on a fallen log. "No need to push yourself to injury." "I'm fine," Nora insisted, though the relief of sitting was evident in her expression. Bryce knelt before her, gesturing to her leg. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Nora nodded. With practical efficiency, Bryce examined her ankle and calf, his touch professional through the layers of clothing. "No swelling that I can detect," he pronounced, "but you've definitely strained it again. We'll take it slower the rest of the way." His concern touched Nora deeply. Throughout her life, she had prided herself on self-sufficiency, on needing no one's assistance or approval. Yet Bryce's care felt not like limitation but like partnership, an acknowledgement of her vulnerability that didn't diminish her strength. "Thank you," she said simply. Bryce met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them. For a heartbeat, Nora thought he might kiss her, wanted him to kiss her, she realized with startling clarity. Instead, he rose to his feet, offering his hand to help her stand. "We should keep moving. Weather's turning again." Indeed, clouds had begun to gather on the western horizon, heavy with the promise of more snow. They resumed their journey, Bryce adjusting his pace to accommodate Nora's slower steps, occasionally supporting her when the terrain became particularly challenging. The first flakes began to fall as the cabin came into view, a welcome sight with smoke curling from its chimney. Bryce had banked the fire before they left, ensuring it would last until their return. Inside, warmth enveloped them like a blessing. They shed their outer layers, hanging snow-dusted coats by the door and removing wet boots. "You should rest that leg," Bryce instructed, helping Nora to a chair. "I'll bring in our findings and get some hot coffee brewing." Nora nodded gratefully, extending her injured leg as Bryce had taught her to reduce swelling. While he made multiple trips to bring in the salvaged items, she found herself watching him, the strength evident in his movements, the consideration with which he arranged her belongings against the wall, the quiet competence that defined everything he did. In just a few days, this man had come to occupy her thoughts in ways she hadn't anticipated. His rescue had saved her life, but it was his respect for her independence, his willingness to teach rather than dictate, that had captured her interest on a deeper level. By the time Bryce finished bringing in the last of their recovered items, fresh snow was falling steadily outside the window. He secured the door against the weather and moved to the fireplace, adding logs to build up the flames. "Looks like we made it back just in time," he observed, nodding toward the window where darkness had fallen along with the snow. "Another hour and we'd have been caught in it." "You read the weather well," Nora complimented. "I'm beginning to understand why you've survived out here alone." Bryce poured coffee for them both, handing Nora a steaming mug before taking the chair opposite her. "It's not just weather reading," he said thoughtfully. "It's knowing your limitations, respecting the land, and being prepared for the unexpected." "All lessons I clearly need to learn," Nora acknowledged with a self-deprecating smile. "You're a quick study," Bryce assured her. "Few people could have made that trek today with a healing injury." His praise warmed Nora more than the coffee. "I had an excellent guide." Their conversation flowed easily as evening deepened outside. They prepared a simple dinner together, working in comfortable tandem as if they had been sharing the space for years rather than days. As they ate, Nora found her thoughts turning to White River and the teaching position that awaited her, a position that now seemed strangely distant despite being only days away. "What is it?" Bryce asked, noting her distraction. Nora hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the conflicted feelings that had begun to surface. "I was just thinking about White River, about starting my position there. Having second thoughts." His tone was neutral, giving away nothing of his own feelings on the matter. "No, not exactly," Nora replied slowly. "It's more that everything seems different now. The journey, the accident, meeting you, it's changed my perspective somehow." Bryce set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "Changed it how? I'm not entirely sure," Nora admitted. "When I left Missouri, I was so focused on what I was leaving behind that I barely considered what I was heading toward. Now, after everything that's happened, I find myself thinking more about what kind of life I truly want to build." "And what have you concluded?" Nora met his gaze directly. "That independence doesn't have to mean isolation. That strength can include knowing when to accept help. That perhaps I've been so determined to prove I don't need anyone that I've closed myself off to genuine connection." The words hung between them, laden with implication. Bryce's expression remained thoughtful, revealing little of his reaction to her candor. "Connection is a risk," he said finally. "Especially out here, where life is uncertain and people come and go with the changing seasons." "Is that why you live alone?" Nora asked quietly. "To avoid that risk?" Bryce looked toward the fire, its light casting shadows across his features. "Partly. After losing everyone during the war, the thought of caring about anyone else was unbearable. Solitude seemed safer. And now," his eyes returned to hers, intense and searching, "now I'm not so sure." The honesty of his response touched something deep within Nora. Here was a man who understood loss, who had chosen solitude not from misanthropy, but from a place of genuine pain, yet who was willing to acknowledge that isolation might not be the answer. "Neither am I," she confessed softly. Something shifted in Bryce's expression, a softening, a decision made. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture both gentle and deliberate. "Nora," he began, his voice low and serious, "I don't know what's happening between us. I only know that finding you in that storm has awakened something I thought was long dead, and the prospect of you leaving for White River in a few days leaves me unsettled." Nora turned her hand beneath his, their palms meeting, fingers intertwining. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This connection, it terrifies me and exhilarates me in equal measure." Bryce's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, the casual intimacy making her heart race. "What do we do about it?" "I don't know," Nora answered honestly. "I have commitments in White River, people depending on me, and you have your life here." "Yes," Bryce acknowledged, "but perhaps neither of those facts precludes exploration of whatever this is between us." Hope fluttered in Nora's chest. "What are you suggesting?" "White River is 15 miles away," Bryce said thoughtfully. "A half-day's ride in good weather, not so far that visits would be impossible." "You would come to town?" Nora asked, surprised. "I thought you avoided settlements." "For you," Bryce said simply, "I would reconsider many things." The declaration, unembellished and sincere, struck Nora with unexpected force. In her experience, men spoke of love and devotion freely, but few were willing to make actual changes to accommodate a woman's choices or ambitions. "And I," she replied with equal sincerity, "would welcome those visits. Very much." Bryce's smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude and sorrow in an instant. He stood, drawing her to her feet and into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. Nora went willingly, her hands resting against his chest as she looked up into his face. The cabin seemed suddenly very quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and their quickened breathing. "May I kiss you, Nora Patterson?" Bryce asked, his voice a rumble she could feel beneath her palms. "Please," she whispered. His lips met hers with exquisite tenderness, a question rather than a demand. Nora responded with equal gentleness, her hands sliding up to his shoulders as the kiss deepened, became an exploration of possibility and promise. When they finally parted, Bryce rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I've been alone a long time," he murmured. "I had forgotten what it feels like to want someone in my life." "And I," Nora replied softly, "had convinced myself that wanting someone meant surrendering my independence. I'm beginning to think I was wrong." Bryce opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with warmth and understanding. "Independence and connection aren't mutually exclusive, Nora. The strongest partnerships are built on respecting each other's autonomy, not diminishing it." His words resonated deeply, articulating exactly what Nora had always sought, but never found: a relationship based on mutual respect rather than possession or control. "I think," she said with a smile, "that we have much to learn from each other, Bryce Buchanan." He kissed her again, briefly but with unmistakable passion. "I look forward to the education." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow glittering like diamonds in the early light. Nora woke to find Bryce already up, preparing breakfast and checking the weather conditions. "How's the trail look?" she asked, joining him at the window. "Passable," he replied. "Another day or two and we could make the journey to White River if your leg is strong enough." Nora nodded, a mixture of anticipation and reluctance stirring within her. The prospect of beginning her teaching position was exciting, but the thought of leaving this cabin, leaving Bryce, created a hollow feeling in her chest. As if reading her thoughts, Bryce turned to her, his expression serious. "Last night, I meant what I said about visiting. This doesn't have to be goodbye." "I know," Nora assured him, reaching for his hand. "And I meant what I said too. Whatever is growing between us, I want to explore it, even with the distance." Relief softened his features. "Good, because I'm not ready to let you go just yet, Nora Patterson." They spent the day in comfortable domesticity, organizing Nora's recovered belongings and preparing for the eventual journey to White River. Bryce crafted a sturdy walking stick to help Nora manage the trip, carving it from a piece of ash wood with meticulous attention to detail. "It's beautiful," Nora exclaimed when he presented it to her, running her fingers over the smooth surface and the simple but elegant patterns he had etched into the handle. "Practical can still be pleasing to the eye," Bryce replied with a smile. "Like a certain schoolteacher I know." Nora laughed, delighted by his unexpected compliment. "Mr. Buchanan, I do believe you're flirting with me." "Guilty as charged," he admitted, pulling her close for a brief kiss, "though I'm sorely out of practice." "I haven't noticed any deficiency," Nora assured him, her cheeks flushed with pleasure. As evening approached, they sat together before the fire, Nora's head resting against Bryce's shoulder, his arm around her waist. The intimacy between them had grown naturally throughout the day, each touch and glance reinforcing the connection that had formed so unexpectedly. "Tell me about the school in White River," Bryce requested. "What are your plans for teaching?" Nora brightened, always eager to discuss education. "It's a small schoolhouse with about 20 children of varying ages. The previous teacher apparently focused only on basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, but I hope to expand the curriculum to include history, literature, and natural sciences." "Ambitious," Bryce observed with approval. "The children will be fortunate to have you. If the town council approves my methods," Nora said, a hint of worry in her voice. "Rural communities can be resistant to educational innovation." "Then you'll need to win them over," Bryce replied confidently. "Show them the value of a broader education. Results will speak for themselves." His unwavering faith in her abilities touched Nora deeply. "You make it sound simple." "Not simple," Bryce corrected. "Challenging, certainly, but you're equal to the challenge, Nora. I've seen your determination firsthand." They discussed her teaching plans further, Bryce offering suggestions based on his own extensive reading and his knowledge of the territory. His insights were thoughtful and practical, demonstrating an intelligence that impressed Nora even as it confirmed her growing feelings for him. The following day brought warmer temperatures, accelerating the melting of snow on the main trails. Bryce spent the morning checking conditions, returning with the news Nora had both anticipated and dreaded. "The path to White River will be clear enough by tomorrow," he announced. "If we leave at first light, we can reach town by midday." Nora nodded, a complex mixture of emotions playing across her features. "Then I should finish packing my things." Bryce caught her hand as she turned away, drawing her back to face him. "Nora, are you certain this is still what you want? You could stay longer, allow your leg more time to heal completely." The temptation to accept his suggestion was powerful. These days in the cabin had been unexpectedly precious, a respite from expectations and obligations, a space where something profound had begun to grow between them. But Nora knew herself too well to succumb to such temptation. She had come west with a purpose, had accepted responsibilities that others depended upon. However strong her feelings for Bryce, abandoning her commitments would ultimately lead to regret. "I need to go," she said gently. "I gave my word to the town council. Children are waiting for their education to continue. I can't let them down." Bryce's expression reflected both disappointment and respect. "I understand. It's one of the things I admire about you, your sense of duty." "But," Nora continued, stepping closer to him, "that doesn't mean this ends tomorrow. You said yourself that White River isn't so far, and I meant what I said about wanting to explore what's between us." Hope kindled in Bryce's eyes. "So we try, despite the distance." "We try," Nora confirmed, reaching up to touch his face. "Unless you've reconsidered." In answer, Bryce pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt about his feelings. Nora responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck as she surrendered to the moment, to the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, this connection was worth pursuing. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Bryce rested his forehead against hers. "I think that answers your question." Nora laughed softly, her heart lighter despite the impending separation. "Indeed it does, Mr. Buchanan, most eloquently." They spent their final evening together in quiet conversation, making plans for Bryce's first visit to White River, and discussing the practicalities of maintaining their budding relationship across the distance that would soon separate them. "The general store receives mail weekly," Bryce explained. "I can check for letters when I come in for supplies." "And I'll write often," Nora promised, "though letters seem a poor substitute for this." She gestured around the cabin, at the intimacy they had created in their short time together, sharing meals, stories, and, increasingly, tender moments of physical affection. "They'll have to suffice between visits," Bryce replied pragmatically. "And they'll give you a chance to tell me about your students, your triumphs and challenges." "You truly want to hear about such things?" Nora asked, touched by his interest in her work. "I want to hear about everything that matters to you," Bryce said simply. "Your teaching, your students, your daily life. All of it." In that moment, Nora realized just how rare and precious Bryce's attitude was, his genuine respect for her as a whole person, not just as a potential romantic partner. It strengthened her resolve to make this unusual arrangement work, despite the obstacles they would face. "I'm going to miss this cabin," she admitted softly as they prepared for bed. "Miss the simplicity of these days together." "The cabin will still be here," Bryce assured her, "waiting for your visits, just as I will be." Morning came all too soon, the eastern sky painted in shades of pink and gold as they loaded Nora's recovered belongings onto Bryce's sturdy horse. They had decided to ride together, with Nora's possessions secured behind the saddle. The journey to White River was quiet, both savoring these final hours together before rejoining the wider world. Bryce pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing stories of his experiences in the territory, and ensuring that Nora would recognize the route should she ever need to travel it alone. As they crested a rise around midday, the settlement came into view, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a main street, with scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding valley. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even at this distance, they could see people moving about their business. "White River," Bryce announced unnecessarily, reining in the horse to allow Nora a moment to absorb the sight of what would be her new home. It was smaller than she had imagined, but not unappealing, a frontier town still establishing itself, with all the challenges and opportunities such places offered. "It's exactly what I was hoping for," she said, her voice firm with renewed purpose. "A place where I can make a difference." Bryce squeezed her hand where it rested at his waist. "They're fortunate to have you, Nora. Never doubt that." They continued down the slope toward the town, aware that their arrival together would likely spark curiosity among the residents. Frontier communities thrived on gossip, and a new schoolteacher arriving in the company of the reclusive trapper from the hills would provide fodder for weeks of speculation. "Are you prepared for the questions?" Nora asked, suddenly concerned about how their relationship might affect Bryce's carefully constructed solitude. "Let them talk," he replied with surprising equanimity. "I've never cared much for others' opinions, and I'm not about to start now." His indifference to potential gossip reassured Nora, who had worried that public scrutiny might cause Bryce to retreat from their nascent relationship. As they rode down the main street, heads indeed turned. Children playing in the snow stopped to stare, and adults emerged from shops to observe their passage. Bryce directed the horse toward a two-story building with a sign identifying it as the White River Hotel and General Store. A middle-aged man with impressive whiskers emerged as they halted, his expression shifting from curiosity to delight as he recognized Nora. "Miss Patterson, I presume?" he exclaimed, hurrying forward. "We'd begun to fear you wouldn't make it before the term started." "I'm Harold Jenkins, head of the town council." Nora smiled, extending her hand as Bryce helped her dismount. "Mr. Jenkins, it's a pleasure to meet you. I apologize for my delayed arrival. I encountered some difficulties on the journey." Jenkins pumped her hand enthusiastically, barely glancing at Bryce. No matter. You're here now, and that's what counts. The children have been without proper instruction for weeks." "My wagon overturned in the blizzard," Nora explained, gesturing to Bryce. "If not for Mr. Buchanan's timely rescue, I fear I wouldn't be here at all." Jenkins turned his attention to Bryce, recognition dawning. "Buchanan, the trapper from the hills. Well, I'll be. Never known you to come to town outside of trading days." "Special circumstances," Bryce replied briefly, beginning to unload Nora's belongings. Jenkins seemed to sense there was more to the story, but was too preoccupied with his new teacher to pursue it. "We've prepared accommodations for you, Miss Patterson. The schoolmaster's cottage behind the schoolhouse. It's modest but comfortable and conveniently located for your duties." "That sounds perfect," Nora assured him, though she couldn't help glancing at Bryce, wondering if the cottage's location would make his visits more complicated. As if reading her thoughts, Bryce caught her eye with a subtle nod of reassurance that such details wouldn't deter him. More townspeople had gathered, drawn by the arrival of their long-awaited teacher. Jenkins made introductions as Bryce quietly continued unloading Nora's possessions, his presence a solid comfort amid the flurry of new faces and names. "We've scheduled your first day of teaching for Monday," Jenkins informed Nora. "That gives you the weekend to settle in and prepare." "I appreciate that," Nora replied. "I'm eager to meet my students and begin our work together." A petite woman with kind eyes stepped forward, introducing herself as Martha Jenkins, the councilman's wife. "I've prepared the cottage for you, dear. Why don't I show you to it now?" "You must be exhausted from your journey." Nora glanced at Bryce, reluctant to part from him so soon but aware that they had reached the point where their paths must temporarily diverge. "Go ahead," he encouraged quietly. "I'll bring your things along." The cottage proved to be exactly as described, small but well-maintained, with a combined living and kitchen area, a separate bedroom, and a small study perfect for preparing lessons. Simple furniture provided the essentials for comfortable living, and Martha had stocked the pantry with basic supplies. "It's lovely," Nora said sincerely, admiring the clean, bright space. "Thank you for making it so welcoming." "It's the least we could do," Martha replied warmly. "We're so pleased to have a qualified teacher for our children. The previous one was, well, less dedicated to education than to finding a husband, it seems." Nora smiled, recognizing the diplomatic phrasing. "I assure you, Mrs. Jenkins, my focus is entirely on providing your children with the best education possible." A knock at the door announced Bryce's arrival with the last of Nora's belongings. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly as she observed the interaction between the new teacher and the solitary trapper, the careful way he arranged her possessions, the softness in his normally stern expression when their eyes met. "Mr. Buchanan," Martha said, her tone carefully neutral, "it was very kind of you to assist Miss Patterson. Will you be staying in town overnight?" The question, innocuous on the surface, carried deeper implications that weren't lost on either Nora or Bryce. "No, madam," Bryce replied respectfully. "I'll be heading back before dark. Just wanted to ensure Miss Patterson was safely settled." Martha nodded, apparently satisfied with this proper response. "Then I'll leave you to say your goodbyes." "Miss Patterson, the council will host a welcome dinner for you tomorrow evening at the hotel. 6 o'clock. After Martha departed, Nora and Bryce found themselves alone for the first time since arriving in White River. The reality of their separation loomed, more difficult than either had anticipated despite their preparations. "So," Nora said softly, "this is where we part ways." "For now," Bryce moved closer, taking her hands in his. "For now," he agreed, "but not for long. I'll come to town next Saturday if that suits you." "It suits me perfectly," Nora replied, squeezing his hands, "though it feels like an eternity to wait." "Well, right," Bryce reminded her, "and you'll be busy with your students. The time will pass quickly." Nora nodded, trying to embrace his pragmatism despite the ache already forming in her chest. "Will you stay a little longer, just until sunset?" Bryce's expression softened with understanding. "Of course. I'd like to help you arrange your things anyway. Make sure you're truly settled before I go." They spent the remaining daylight hours organizing Nora's belongings, transforming the impersonal cottage into a space that reflected her personality and priorities. Her books were arranged carefully on the shelves in the study, her teaching materials organized for easy access, her few personal items displayed where they would bring her comfort. Throughout their work, they talked of practical matters: when Bryce would next visit, how they would exchange letters, what Nora planned for her first days of teaching. The conversation helped normalize their situation, transforming what might have been a painful goodbye into a temporary parting within an ongoing relationship. As the sun began to set, however, the moment of farewell could no longer be delayed. They stood in the cottage doorway, reluctance evident in both their postures. "Write to me about your first day with the students," Bryce requested, his hand cupping her cheek gently. "I want to know everything: the troublemakers, the eager learners, all of it." Nora leaned into his touch, memorizing the feel of his calloused palm against her skin. "I will. And you must tell me about your trap lines and your prospecting. Don't spare the details. I want to picture your days clearly." Bryce nodded, then bent to kiss her, a lingering farewell that conveyed all the emotions neither could fully articulate. When they parted, his eyes held a promise that comforted Nora more than words could have. "Until Saturday," he said, reluctantly stepping away. "Until Saturday," Nora echoed, watching as he mounted his horse and rode out of town, his figure gradually disappearing into the gathering dusk. The first week in White River passed in a blur of activity for Nora. Her students, 22 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, proved to be bright, curious, and desperately in need of consistent education. The town council welcomed her enthusiastically, relieved to have secured a teacher with proper qualifications and evident dedication. True to her promise, Nora wrote to Bryce every evening, detailing her experiences and impressions. She described her students, from shy little Emma Wilson with her remarkable facility for numbers to troublesome Thomas Parker, whose disruptive behavior masked a keen intelligence starved for challenge. She wrote of the town itself, the people she was meeting, the society she was gradually becoming part of. On Wednesday, a letter arrived from Bryce, delivered by a young man who had encountered him on the trail and agreed to carry the message to town. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant, his observations astute and often amusing. He described his daily activities with the detailed precision she had requested, allowing her to visualize his life in the hills while they were apart. Saturday could not come quickly enough. When Bryce finally rode into town shortly after noon, Nora was waiting, having dismissed her students early after a productive morning of lessons. The sight of him, solid and real after days of absence, filled her with a joy that confirmed the depth of her feelings. They spent the afternoon together, Nora proudly showing him the schoolhouse where she taught and introducing him to those townspeople they encountered. If some eyebrows were raised at the evident closeness between the refined schoolteacher and the solitary trapper, neither Nora nor Bryce paid them any mind. That evening, they shared a simple meal in Nora's cottage, talking long into the night about everything and nothing, reconnecting after their separation with a comfort and ease that belied the newness of their relationship. When Bryce finally departed, promising to return the following Saturday, the parting was easier than before, tempered by the certainty of reunion and the rhythm they were establishing for their unconventional courtship. The pattern continued through the winter months: weekly visits, regular letters, and a deepening connection that flourished despite their physical separation. Bryce began to spend occasional nights in town, staying at the hotel to extend their time together, especially when weather threatened to make travel difficult. The townspeople, initially curious about the relationship, gradually accepted it as part of the community's fabric. Bryce's reputation for honesty in his trading and his obvious respect for Nora earned him a measure of acceptance he had never sought but now appreciated for her sake. By early spring, as the snow began to melt and the first green appeared on the hills. Their feelings for each other had grown from tentative attraction to profound love. They spoke of it openly now, planning a future that would accommodate both Nora's teaching career and Bryce's preference for the wilderness. "What if," Bryce suggested one April evening as they walked along the riverbank, "you were to continue teaching through the school year, but spend summers at the cabin with me?" Nora considered the idea, finding it unexpectedly appealing. "The school term ends in May and doesn't resume until September. That would give us nearly 4 months together each year. And I would continue my weekly visits during the school months," Bryce added. "It wouldn't be a conventional arrangement, but then, we're not exactly conventional people." Nora laughed, squeezing his hand where it held hers. "No, we certainly are not, and I find I prefer it that way." As they walked, a thought occurred to Nora, one that had been forming gradually over the past months but now crystallized into certainty. "Bryce," she said, stopping to face him, "what if our arrangement were more permanent?" He looked at her questioningly, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Nora continued, gathering her courage, "what if we were to marry? I could still teach during the school year and join you in the hills for summers, but as your wife rather than merely your companion." Bryce's expression transformed, joy breaking through his customary reserve like sunlight through clouds. "Nora Patterson, are you proposing to me?" "I believe I am," she confirmed with a smile. "Unless you'd prefer to do the asking." Instead of answering immediately, Bryce reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a ring crafted from gold he had panned himself, set with a tiny but perfect diamond. "I've been carrying this for weeks," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Waiting for the right moment, gathering my courage." Nora's breath caught at the sight of the ring, at the realization that he had been planning the same future she envisioned. "It seems we had the same idea," she said softly. Bryce took her hand, his expression more serious now, filled with purpose and love. "Nora Patterson, you found me when I wasn't looking to be found. You brought warmth back into a life grown cold with solitude. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of happiness blurred Nora's vision as she nodded. "Yes, Bryce Buchanan, with all my heart, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if destined to be there. Then he gathered her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of partnership, respect, and love. News of their engagement spread quickly through White River, met with a mixture of surprise and approval. The schoolteacher and the trapper made an unusual pair, but their devotion to each other was evident to all who saw them together. They were married in late May, after the school term ended, a simple ceremony in the town's small church, attended by Nora's students, the town council, and a few of Bryce's trading associates. Nora wore a dress of pale blue silk ordered specially from Sioux Falls, and Bryce stunned everyone by appearing in a proper suit rather than his usual frontier attire. Following the ceremony and a modest reception at the hotel, they departed for Bryce's cabin in the hills, now their shared home for the summer months. As they rode together on Bryce's horse, Nora leaning comfortably against her husband's chest, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Bryce asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "About the blizzard," Nora replied honestly. "About being trapped beneath that wagon, certain I was going to die alone in the snow." Bryce's arms tightened around her. "I still thank Providence I found you that day." "As do I," Nora agreed. "Though I've come to believe it wasn't mere chance that brought you to that spot at that precise moment." "Oh, what was it then?" Nora turned slightly in the saddle to look up at him, her expression serene with certainty. "Destiny." the universe conspiring to bring together two souls who needed each other, even if neither realized it at the time. Bryce smiled, the expression transforming his face in the way that still made Nora's heart skip a beat. Destiny, I've never considered myself a believer in such things, but in this case, I might make an exception. They crested the final rise before the cabin, the structure coming into view solid, welcoming, and now the beginning point of their shared life rather than a solitary refuge. "Welcome home, Mrs. Buchanan," Bryce said softly as they approached. "Home," Nora repeated, the word carrying a weight and significance it never had before. "Yes, I believe it is." The years that followed brought changes to both their lives. Nora continued teaching in White River, her innovative methods and genuine care for her students transforming the small schoolhouse into a model of frontier education. During the school terms, she lived in the teacher's cottage, with Bryce visiting weekly as promised, sometimes staying in town for several days, especially during the harsh winter months. Summers were spent in their cabin in the hills, which Bryce gradually expanded to accommodate their growing family. Their first child, a son they named William after Bryce's fallen brother, was born in the spring of 1881. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later. As the children grew old enough for education, Nora and Bryce faced new decisions about their unconventional living arrangement. Rather than disrupting the pattern that had served them so well, they chose to continue with the addition of homeschooling during the summer months to ensure their children's education remained consistent. William and Elizabeth thrived in their unique upbringing, developing both the refined manners and education Nora prioritized and the practical wilderness skills Bryce valued. They moved between town and cabin with ease, equally comfortable in both environments. In 1885, a severe winter storm struck the region, reminiscent of the blizzard that had first brought Nora and Bryce together. As they huddled in their expanded cabin with their children, the wind howling outside, Bryce recounted the story of their meeting, of finding Nora trapped beneath her overturned wagon, of carrying her to safety through the blinding snow. "I've got you safe now," 7-year-old William quoted solemnly, repeating the words he had heard many times before. "That's what Papa said to Mama. And he's kept that promise ever since," Nora added, exchanging a loving glance with her husband across the table where they were playing checkers with the children. Later that night, with the children asleep in their small room, Nora and Bryce sat before the fire, much as they had on that first evening 7 years earlier. "Do you ever regret it?" Bryce asked suddenly. "Our arrangement, the divisions of your time, the compromises you've made?" Nora studied him, surprised by the question after so many years of evident contentment. "Never. Not for a moment. Do you?" "No," Bryce assured her quickly. "I just sometimes wonder if I've asked too much of you to live this split existence between town and wilderness." Nora moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Bryce Buchanan, look at our life. We have 2 beautiful, intelligent children. I have a career I love and a husband who supports my ambitions rather than stifling them. You have maintained your connection to these hills you love while building a family you once thought impossible." She touched his face gently, turning it toward hers. "We found a way to have everything that matters to both of us. That's not compromise, it's triumph." Bryce smiled, the doubt in his eyes receding. "How did I get so fortunate to find a woman who sees triumph where others would see only complication?" "You rescued her from beneath a wagon in a blizzard," Nora reminded him with a teasing smile. "And said the exact right words at the exact right moment." "I've got you safe now," Bryce quoted softly, drawing her into his arms. Nora nestled against him, secure in the knowledge that those words had proven true in ways neither could have imagined on that snow-swept mountain pass. Together, they had created safety not just from physical danger, but from the emotional perils of conformity and expectation, carving out a life that honored both their individual natures and their profound connection. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the sturdy cabin walls, but within, all was warmth and certainty, a sanctuary built not of logs and stone but of understanding and love, destined to endure long after the storm had passed.